pelting of rotten eggs and mud inside UP campus to former Armed Forces Chief of Staff Hermogenes Esperon, the burning of chairs of some PUP protesters against the impending tuition hike, the heckling of activists against President Aquino in several occasions. And recently, the confrontation between Budget Secretary Butch Abad and UP activists about the disbursement acceleration program. These are some of the methods through which activists expressed their dissent to the government. But some believe that these acts have gone overboard and have become a display of hooliganism. Some faculty members of the UP School of Economics in a statement said the act against Butch Abad is a blow to UP's honor. UP President Alfredo Pascual also released a statement saying that they are investigating this disappointing act, echoing the palace's dismay. But the Student Alliance for the Advancement of Democratic Rights in UP, or Stand UP, the organizer of that protest, said they will not apologize and that Secretary Abad deserves it as he represents the ongoing greed and corruption in the government. Welcome to Opposing Views, a hard, straightforward discussion of today's most pressing issues. Tonight, we'll weigh in if the recent run-in of militant students to Secretary Budget Butch Abad is a legitimate act of protest or a display of violence. Our debate question for tonight is the recent confrontation between UP activists and Butch Abad justified? Good evening, I'm Nepomuceno, and this is Opposing Views. Joining us tonight in our discussion is Professor Danilo Arao, Faculty Advisor of the Student Alliance for the Advancement of Democratic Rights in UP, or Stand UP. Professor Danny, good evening.
Yes, good evening, Rob.
Welcome back to Opposing Views.
Yes, of course. I'm happy to be here.
All right. Can you give us your quick thoughts on this debate question? You think that the actions of the UP students were justified?
It's very much justified if you look at the culture of dissent and the culture of protest at not just the University of the Philippines, but in other places of the country. Please remember that the so-called violent acts only constitute what? The throwing of crumpled papers against a particular government official who is said to be the chief architect of the disbursement acceleration program. It is a symbol of collective dissent as to why this government official and the administration insist on implementing a program that is already declared unconstitutional by no less than the Supreme Court. So it's very much justified for me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Danny. And on the opposing side is Professor Sylvia Claudio of the UP College of Social Work and Community Development. Good evening, Professor Sylvia.
Good evening.
And welcome again.
Yes, thank you. Nice to be here again.
Yeah, your quick thoughts on this debate question. Do you think it was justified, the acts of the UP students?
Well, no, not really. And I read the report and looked at the incident itself. I thought it was a little bit more than crumpled papers. I heard there were coins tossed, and that they did try to collar him or touch him. And my view is, for this particular incident, wrong place, not in the university should we do that, because he was invited as well. And perhaps wrong timing. And maybe we can discuss that a little bit more.
A little bit more in detail. All right, thank you very much. And again, thank you for joining us this evening. So again, I'd like to discuss again your initial thoughts. No? When this happened, obviously there were a lot of claims. No? There were some claims by Secretary Abad, and when he reported this or made statements to the media, and then obviously there was a statement on the part of the UP students. Professor Danny, your initial thoughts. What went through your mind when you heard about this, and do you think that this is at par with what is expected from UP students?
Well, I wasn't there when the confrontation happened. Actually, I was in Malate, Manila for a family gathering, but I was duty-bound as a faculty advisor of Stand UP to ask what really happened.
Because they were there.
Yeah, because they were there. And from what I gathered, it appears that, yes, the crumpled papers were thrown, but as far as the coin throwing was concerned and the so-called pagcuello, or the collaring of the, if such a word exists, of Butch Abad, wasn't instigated by Stand UP. Assuming that it happened,
it wasn't there. You think
it wasn't
outsiders
them.
were involved?
Probably, because if you look at the press release of Anakbayan National, which is a different organization, there was mention about coins. As regards placards and the collars, the data would be quite insufficient to judge. But nevertheless, assuming for the sake of argument that such things really happened,
coins.
Would it really constitute violence? Was there harm done on Butch Abad? Well, his pride may have been hurt, his ego may have been shattered because of what happened, but he did not sustain any serious injuries. And in fact, he was even allowed to get inside his SUV. And one little detail that wasn't mentioned publicly is the fact that the guards of Abad even mentioned to the stand-up students, sagasaan na yan. Okay? So there was actually harassment being done, ironically, on the students who were protesting, when in fact it's supposed to be their campus and they have the right to express dissent. And why should we welcome that kind of a person who, as we mentioned a while ago, is the chief instigator of the presidential pork barrel? So we shouldn't lose sight, and we shouldn't be discussing too much time as to whether or not the acts were violent. We should be focusing on the contextual accuracy of the issue, which is the disbursement acceleration program.
Whether contextually that reaction was merited.
That's
All
correct.
right, Professor Sylvia, do you think the students went overboard? Again, as mentioned by Professor Danny, there are some conflicting reports whether the students themselves threw coins, or whether there was collaring or pulling of the sleeves, as claimed by Secretary Abad.
Yes.
But do you think, assuming those things happened, do you think that the students may have just gone a little bit overboard in this situation?
Yeah, I base my my judgment on the official statement of the UP School of Economics Student Council, who invited Secretary Abad as one of the groups who sponsored that talk, and they did mention that there was a group of students and non-students. The statement was Anakbayan rather,
National,
and another group affiliated with Stand UP. So they sort of thought that this was one group together, that this group of both students and non-students had really barred all exits to make sure that they would catch Secretary Abad. And the UP School of Economics Student Council, in fact, denounced it was their term, the violence. So I think two issues here, and perhaps we should also look at whether, no matter how incensed you are at what a person does, is it really in the university a call for that kind of aggressive and hostile reaction to a person who was also invited? Actually, the UP School of Economics and the UP Student Council and the UP Student Council itself of Diliman had invited
and what do you
Secretary
use aggressive
Abad.
and hostile action? Because obviously, I think here it's sometimes a matter of definition. Some people might not be too insulted with a crumpled piece of paper, or perhaps an egg, for example, or a slipper that happened to some U.S. presidents.
Yes.
But in your mind, when do you draw the line? What is aggressive and hostile behavior?
Well, I put myself, I've experienced also some amount of aggression, mostly verbal.
Yes.
From student activists
and is this
who
acceptable?
quite don't agree. Well,
is this acceptable?
Let me give you an example. A friend said that in one of the discussion boards about this issue, where I have taken a stand against it, somebody commented, "Kalad ka rin na yan si Claudio sa lansangan." Okay, ang reaction ko doon, well, of course, it's may karapatan naman siyang sabihin doon.
I mean, it's words, but it has a violent kind of
connotation.
It's a little bit,
it's a little bit.
Okay.
And I coming now from I said place, no? Kasi UP, UP is really a place where I think we should be more allowing of all the views and perhaps putting a premium on letting people be comfortable in stating even those ideas that maybe I personally don't really want to hear. No? So I also don't like the DAP.
Yeah.
I also have publicly called, in fact, for the resignation of Secretary Abad in my column in Rappler. So it isn't, I think, for me, no, a matter of how you stand on a particular issue. It's really the question of how we express our dissent in a particular venue.
Okay. Professor Danny, when is violence acceptable to you? And as a follow-up to there, no, you think there's an acceptable reason in this situation? There was an acceptable reason why there was such, I guess, actions. First off, you think when is violence to you kind of acceptable?
Of course, violence can never be acceptable in the legal arena because, well, it's not just the law that we're talking about. We're also talking about conduct unbecoming of people. But in situations where there are extreme measures that are undertaken by certain groups, you have to ask yourself, why do they have to resort to that? Why can't they be quote-unquote civil or have good manners and right conduct? It's because you cannot insist on civility at a time when the powers that be are imposing their will with impunity. Because the culture of impunity should be taken into account as regards the insistence of the powers that be to continue a program that's unconstitutional and to not account for the 10 billion pesos of DAP from 2010 to 2013. And the data would show that those who benefited from the DAP are allies of the Aquino administration, starting off with Abaya, who's the head of the Liberal Party and Transportation Secretary. We have Speaker Belmonte. And number 6 is the wife of the Budget Secretary. And we have to keep this in mind in order to properly contextualize the actions of the students, because
why there was such an anger?
Yes, because if we don't look at the context, then we will just assume that this thing happened in a vacuum. So therefore, we will just judge the action based on what it is minus the context. In journalism, which I've been teaching since 2001, we look at two kinds of accuracy. Factual accuracy, we cannot be selective of the facts, and number 2, contextual accuracy. So that's where we can appreciate the bigger picture, and our appeal to our audience would be to ensure that there is openness in terms of looking at the issue at hand.
Context,
because it's not the violence that we're talking about of the students, it's the violence of the state rather.
All right. Okay, at this point, we need to take a short break. Meanwhile, you can react online via Facebook at facebook.com/opposing views on 9TV, or tweet your comments at opposing_views. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're still watching Opposing Views. I'm Nepomuceno. We have with us Professor Danilo Arao and Professor Sylvia Claudio. Our debate question for tonight is, the recent confrontation between UP activists against Butch Abad justified? All right. Professor Danny, was the act against Secretary Abad, do you think that that's the sentiment of the whole nation? Because that seems to be what the students are saying, that we represent the sentiment of the country. Do you think that that's an accurate statement?
When we say sentiments of the country, we're not talking of whether or not it is shared by the majority of the population. Because when you analyze social issues, you take into account what's good for the basic sectors of society. The fact that you're speaking out for them means that you're trying your best to institute social change, something that you do for the better. So, for example, as far as corruption is concerned, we don't need to conduct a survey whether or not people are pro-corruption or anti-corruption. It's common sense. So the same thing applies to the disbursement acceleration program. It's been already declared unconstitutional. So why is it that the government would implement still such an unconstitutional policy? So it's a cut and dry situation. And I think the basic point of contention here between Guy and I is the action itself of the students. And as I said, it's context that we should be talking about here. And we should not be selective of the facts. We are all too much preoccupied with how Secretary Abad was hurt. But the data from Stand UP would show that there were 3 students who were hurt. Even the chair of Stand Up, Charlotte France, sustained injuries as a result of the scuffle with the guards and the police and other people protecting Abad. So these things would have to be taken into account. Stand UP tried to talk to the 2 staff and 1 student who were allegedly hurt because of the scuffle. And all the SE Student Council did was to withhold their names dahil ayaw daw magpakilala. But we'll take their word for that. But there is an effort for Stand UP to address such concerns because that's how open-minded these students are.
Okay, Professor Guy, do you think that the actions of the Stand UP students, and perhaps those who are there, no, maybe Akbayan, do you think it represented the sentiment of the nation? And I'm talking about the actions, maybe not the side that they were taking. I think, as pointed out by Professor Danny, whether it was that sentiment is majority or minority, they would have done the same thing. No? But do you think, though, that the actions themselves, do you think that that's consistent to what probably the majority of the people would want to see?
I think the controversy itself, that has now in fact centered on whether what they did was right or wrong, shows you that perhaps there was an error here in estimating the sentiments of the people. Because I would agree with Professor Danny here, that what we should really have highlighted was what he calls the context. But what I'm seeing in media, and what we're discussing in fact here, is really, mali yung mga estudyante, ang babastos naman nila. You're hearing comments like that. And I think if you're an activist that wants persuasion, you should very, very be critical of the tactics you use. If you're able to win over people. So again, if it's not the issue, then did we win over people? But let me backtrack a little bit, no? Because I also would think that there is a context, and the context is the violence of a system is very different from the actual physical violence that I could do, let's say to you, Rod, right? And I'm very, as a woman who's been working on violence against women, and before that on people who have been tortured by the Marcos dictatorship, I am very, very careful about the slide conceptually. When you label something violent because it's systemic, and then the slide into physical violence. Because for me,
you're saying both are violence.
Yeah, but they're not the same. And we cannot answer systemic violence with violence to one person. And while there is indeed a power context here, and I would agree that the system, Abad and Aquino, certainly hold all the cards in many situations. My understanding, because of my work, is that we have to take into consideration that even the situation where Abad was in, he was actually in a kung physical violence, I think he was at a disadvantage here. Because even if he had security, there were far more protesters who could have hurt him. That's one. And of course, I saw the video. I think the physical violence, whether that's mild or not, is a matter of contention, was instigated by the student.
If he didn't have the guards, do you think he would have been physically hurt, you think?
I believe so. And I also think then that, because it's clear to me that if you are being physically threatened, then perhaps you can have some amount of physical protection, retaliation to yourself. So as I've always said, I think before we decide whether violence physical is justified, you have to be very, very reluctant to use it, because it's often very wrong.
Probably the last resort.
It's probably very wrong. You have to look very carefully at whether you want this to happen. And then, of course, you have to expect a certain amount of retaliation from the person. Pero my bottom line here is, I really have seen too often this conceptual slide saying they were violent naman symbolically. And my appeal really is, please then also win oppose symbolic violence with symbolic violence. Fight systemic violence with systemic methods. And then if it is then physically violent, I think it's very justified for you then to also retaliate with physical violence. But I think morally, dangerous talaga yun.
Dangerous.
Dangerous talaga yung you think the violence is just the same.
They went
It's
beyond
not.
the line. Right.
It's not. Physical violence is not the same as systemic violence. It just isn't.
Okay. Now, Professor Danny, your thoughts.
Well, again, we're not talking of physical violence here. We're talking of throwing of crumpled papers against the secretary. Okay, we can grant even the throwing of coins. I mean, it's not as if he got serious injuries out of it.
Well, if it was a 10 centavo coin or 5 centavo coin, I'm sure there was nothing. But the moment you throw 5 peso
unfortunately,
coins,
we don't know what kind of coins were being thrown. But knowing the students, they don't have, UP students, usually activists, don't have that much money. So I doubt if they'll be throwing, hundreds of coins against the secretary. But nevertheless, we do agree that physical violence has no place in the university. That much is a given. But the question here is, did violence really happen that fateful night of September 17? So we go back to that issue. And the belief that had Abad not been duly protected, he would be physically harmed by Stand UP. Again, we ask the question, is there a track record of Stand UP and its allied organizations engaging in violent behavior, beating up students, for example, during elections, or kicking and punching any students that would disagree with them? I doubt it.
There's none. Okay.
Because there's none. And in fact, I would be the first to castigate Stand UP if they would resort to that. In fact, student council elections in the university, while they may have been shouting matches every now and then or heckling, they did not resort to physical violence. Of course, the exception would be the fraternities, because sometimes there would be fraternity rumbles related to the elections. But nevertheless, Stand UP as itself has exercised restraint even, because I would agree, had they wanted to hurt physically Abad, there are 50 to 60 or so students that night, and they could have done it. But based on the video, we may be looking at the same video but with different frameworks, they did not engage in any violent act. They did not punch the guards so that they can get out of the way and then hurt Abad in the process. What they did was to throw papers, because it's not symbolic violence, but a symbolic protest.
Now, some sectors have sort of like described the students as hooligans. Now, do you think that they fall under that description?
Well, Guy and I are both editors of the Philippine Collegian in our youth, and we know that the definition of hooligan is usually a young man who engages in violent behavior in a group or a gang. So we're talking here of two things. Number one, young man. Remember that the chair of Stand UP is a female student at that. So by virtue of that, hooligan is out of the question. And the other term has to do with violent behavior. So there's no violence there. And then involvement in a gang. It's not like saying that if a female student is dating a particular Stand UP member, is it like saying that she's dating a gangster? I don't think so. Because it's not a gangster group. It's a political party that stands for certain principles that Guy may not agree with, but nevertheless, we have to respect that kind of ideological persuasion, because
but can there be, let's say,
for the good of the country.
Perhaps a burning of effigy or something, or perhaps maybe placards that are really huge? Does it have to be a throwing of particular things, even if it was crumpled paper? Again, you're right. Maybe it's not violence to you, but for some people, it does invade their personal space.
Yeah, it may be going overboard allegedly. Well, that's the purpose, I think, in order
to draw attention.
To draw attention, number one. But more than drawing attention, it is to give a wake-up call to the powers that be that stand up is not taking things sitting down.
But taking from Professor Guy's statement earlier, I think, and if you read social media, there seems to have been at least sympathy on the part of Secretary Abad. There were people who were saying that you can't correct a wrong by doing something wrong. By doing that, then it becomes wrong, and you become the same as the person you're complaining about. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's a good point. But we have to also balance it with those who sympathize with Stand UP. Now, granting for the sake of argument that majority of the population have a negative reaction to what happened, it simply means that there is a bigger challenge for Stand UP and other so-called activist organizations to try to, what Guy said, win over people to explain contextually what happened. Because, for example, we all have a clear appreciation of what the disbursement acceleration program is and why it's presidential pork, and why our taxpayers' money are being wasted by the powers that be. So if people would learn to appreciate that, then more or less, it's either they would side with the students or at least they would be open-minded enough or sympathetic enough to understand the situation, reminiscent of what happened during the Diliman Commune and the first quarter storm, which was actually very violent, but still, in the annals of history, it is judged as something that was absolutely necessary.
All right. All right, we need to take a short break. Again, more on the issue of the alleged hooliganism of the UP students. You're watching Opposing Views. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're still watching Opposing Views. I'm Nepomuceno. Still with us, Professor Danilo Araw, Faculty Advisor of the Student Alliance for the Advancement of Democratic Rights in UP, or STAND UP, and Professor Sylvia Claudio of the UP College of Social Work and Community Development. Our question for tonight: is the recent confrontation between UP activists and Secretary Butch Abad justified? Now, just before the break, we were discussing kind of like the levels of violence. No? May mga certain, we can all agree that there are certain levels of violence. Of course. And I think, Professor Guy, you wanted to make a comment on the discussion of Professor Danny insofar as what is probably acceptable violence, or the different types of violence, and what is acceptable violence. Is there such thing, is there a degree of violence that's acceptable in this scenario?
Yes, because I'm a bit surprised that it became an issue about whether there was violence or not, because in the discussion boards that I had been looking at and engaging in, the real question is whether this violence was justified. So now the question of how do we determine if it's violence or not? And again, in my work with torture survivors and with women who have experienced violence, I often see this, that the victim who experienced it is already saying, I felt violated. I don't think this was right. I felt threatened, no? And then the person who did the violence, the husband who's doing the battering, or especially the torturer. Although certainly I wouldn't compare the UP students to a torturer. But I guess the point I'm just trying to make is that really I would believe, I think we should base on the reactions of the person, whether they felt they experienced violence and whether they felt threatened. Now that's the first, no? Kahit sabihin mo mataas yung standard ko, the reason why I'm appealing for a high standard is, again, the context for me is not just that, but this is the University of the Philippines. It's an academic institution.
And the National University.
And the National University. Two things. I've heard na, we're paying your taxes, behave properly. Perhaps that is a smaller argument. The bigger one for me really is that there are certain places where the free exchange of ideas in situations where people feel safe, including Secretary Abad, who I would agree with the UP students, perhaps we are incensed by his behavior. No? But anyone, whether our enemy or not, should be able to feel that they are freely able to express their sentiments.
And probably defend themselves.
And defend themselves in an academic institution. Perhaps outside, in Plaza Miranda, it might be a different issue, but in UP, I think we really need to put a very, very high standard on the safety of expression.
Professor Guy, you're saying that the standard should be different in UP vis-a-vis, let's say, in Plaza Miranda or anywhere else?
Maybe not in terms of violence, but in terms of expressing ideas.
To express yourself.
To be quite frank, whether it's Secretary Abad or any student of mine or a co-professor, if anybody said to me, in UP, I felt threatened because I expressed an idea, physically threatened, which is actually what Secretary Abad said,
that's not
then
ideal.
It's not acceptable to me. That is not what should happen in an academic institution.
Okay, Professor Danny, your turn.
Well,
your thoughts on that?
I guess the victim here would not be Secretary Abad. I'm not sure if Guy and I agree, but the victim here would be corny as it may sound, the Filipino in general who felt betrayed by the actions
That's not
of
corny.
the Budget Secretary. Yeah.
Because that's all of us. Yeah.
May I
we're a
just
bit being
interrupt?
general,
just
but,
on this
okay,
point,
no problem.
I heard na
No
pwedeng
problem.
mag-interrupt.
Yeah,
Just on
absolutely.
this,
Professor Guy,
No
go ahead.
problem.
Yeah.
Here again, Professor Danny, is
Yes.
my point about sliding into different concepts of violence. Because the victim of the physical violence was Secretary Abad.
So he's a victim here, right?
Of the physical violence. Kasi
What
when you
violence
say,
are we talking about
well,
here?
throwing of coins and paper.
Okay,
And
so it's a violent
so,
behavior
yeah,
already. Okay.
So let's
We'll grant that.
Again, I will just the reason I wanted to interrupt was that's
Yes.
my main point. I think it's very difficult to slide conceptually from saying ang biktima ang Filipino
Taong
people.
bayan.
Of course they are. Corruption, DAP, misgovernance, of course they're the victims.
And-
right. But this is the systemic violence which we all condemn.
And therefore,
But to elide systemic violence with physical violence in order to justify physical violence, I think this is taking a morally
What's the proper-
difficult
what's the
and
proper
therefore,
reaction, though?
I think we should
I
ask
don't-
ourselves.
Yes, go ahead.
We should therefore ask ourselves, why was Abad a victim of a symbolic protest? Because, well, there is a difference of opinion as regards violence, but let's look at the protest action itself. Okay? So why was he a victim in the first place? It's because he was responsible for this. Okay? Now, it's true. He felt threatened, and anybody, any government official who would trample on the rights of people, who would be responsible for the violations of the basic rights, socioeconomic rights, human rights, political and civil rights, the message is clear because of what Stand Up did. They're not welcome in the university. They're not welcome anywhere where people are suffering. So we have to contextualize again, why was Abad a victim of a symbolic protest? Why was he at the receiving end of the crumpled
You're saying
papers?
he brought it to himself. That's what you're saying? He deserved
The
it?
system that he belongs to brought it to himself because, yes, he is a chief architect of the disbursement acceleration program after all. If it were a middle level manager of the DBM who went to the School of Economics, I don't think the students will have the same reaction. But this is the face of the disbursement acceleration program. So conceptually, it's valid that he be the subject of a symbolic protest.
Now, let me shift gears a bit. Do you think that this whole situation, do you think it was a blow to UP's honor?
If at
You think it was a
all-
disgrace?
If at all, it reaffirms what UP stands for and what the university should stand for, which is what? A basic venue for dissent, a basic venue for ferreting out what should be an injustice. The late SP Lopez and even the other UP president, Vicente Cinco, actually encouraged activism among students and even mass actions.
I was going to ask you, do you think that this, what the students did here, do you think it differed from the activism that they usually practice in the past?
Well, there is consistency in terms of ideological persuasion. But of course, in terms of strategies and tactics, Guy is correct in saying that there are certain adjustments along the way. In fact, I can even argue that the throwing of crumpled papers is a step back to the throwing of rotten tomatoes, rotten eggs, and even green paint
You say a
against the
step back,
UPLB
it's
Chancellor.
less.
It's
less violent.
Yeah. Well, no, not less violent, but it's a different form. It's not as, well, for practical reasons, it's not as expensive as buying tomatoes and eggs
Yeah,
because
sayang
you just
naman yung,
buy paper.
sayang naman yung tomatoes. Now,
Yeah.
Professor Guy,
symbolic violence, you can't be a victim of symbolic violence.
Symbolic protest po ginamit ko.
You can be the subject of symbolic
but
protest.
you can't be a victim of it.
Yes, but you can be a victim of systemic or even symbolic violence. But when that happens, we are all victims. But the point is, I would say that basing on Secretary Abad's reaction, and I have laid down the moral basis of that, he was the victim of physical violence. And again, for me, really, it's really an appeal not to confuse the two, because we will, if we do, we justify, like the torturer and like the batterer, physical violence against another human being.
Yeah.
To say, therefore, also that anyone is not welcome in UP, to me goes against the very, to say their ideas,
Corrupt
goes
people are
against
not
the
welcome
very
in UP.
core of the university. Anyone has an idea, and he came to explain,
Professor Danny said that
oo.
corrupt people are not welcome in UP.
No.
They're welcome.
Okay, so-
Okay,
No,
thank
their
you.
corruption is not welcome in UP.
But corrupt people are
But
okay.
if they want to explain their ideas, and here's where I'm going now. It's not also true that the tradition of student activism is always this way. Because I also was a student activist in my day, and we studied We studied, and there are also great instances where we came up, even through martial law, we would come up to the government officials, enter the forum, and whip them with superior arguments and show really the context that Professor Arauz is trying to show.
Yeah.
So there has been a long history of students not pounding their fists because their arguments are weak, or pounding on the table because their arguments are weak. You know that saying, right?
That saying, yeah.
There has been, in fact, I think more consistent with the student activism that is the tradition in UP is this very great set of argumentations that make your point, that explain the issue, that would have put Secretary Abad to shame, because I really believe that there is a mistake in that, and to put him in the spot.
Yeah, but
so the question really is, which of these different tactics that is in UP traditions would have been the right thing to use?
All right.
yeah, we have to remember that in the Balitaktakan forum, the question and answer portion was only 5 minutes long, and the students and other audiences were only required to write down their questions. So there's no way to engage Secretary Abad. That's why the stand-up members and allies ended up waiting outside so that he can be properly engaged.
Okay.
But the problem is there was that lack of factual appreciation among the public, hence the misunderstanding.
All right. There are a lot of comments coming in, and I'd like to quote several comments, and I'd like your reaction on these comments. We have you have Tony Lavinia, Dean of the Ateneo College of Law, and his comment was, one of my former students reposted the article on Secretary Abad being mobbed at UP with this comment: "I agree fully with him, and I quote, only time will speak up on this. Secretary Abad has done more for this country than any activist can do or imagine."
Definitely, he has done a lot more in terms of corrupting our money and plundering our nation's economy. Definitely, he did a lot. So thank you, Tony, for that comment.
All right.
My reaction,
Professor Guy, yeah?
my reaction is always that moral certainty of the evil of the other person is no excuse for going into violence. Because, again, the torturer is morally certain. Palparan did this, the torturers that during martial law did this.
ISIS claims this.
ISIS claims
that
this,
they have moral,
the batterer claims this. So moral certainty of the evil of the other person, again, does not justify physical violence.
Okay, and at this point, I'd like to quote another important person in the world of, in the education field, Father Rogelio Aquino, who is the Dean of San Beda College. There is no justification, according to him, there's no justification for rudeness, not the ugly form that it took when students at what is supposed to be the country's premier university shoved, collared, and pelted Secretary Butch Abad. DAP or no DAP. Rudeness is going back on what centuries of living in the Civitas should have taught us. Your thoughts on that?
Again, we have to properly qualify what we mean by rudeness, because there is a symbolic protest. And a symbolic protest cannot be civil or refined by its very nature, because it tends to disrupt something that we normally see. For example, the pretension of peace and calm in the university was obviously disrupted because of the mass action. And it reminded us not just of the tradition of dissent in the university, but the tradition of continuing struggle in Philippine society in general, because there should be something wrong in a situation where students would go through such creative measures to ensure that the message would be sent to Secretary Abad as well as other government officials who are screwing not just the people but the economy in general.
Symbolic violence need not, symbolic protest need not be rude. It only has to be effective. And even rude, non-symbolic protests can be quite disruptive. I will, of course, a very good example is Gandhi. They were never rude nor violent. In fact, they allowed themselves to be physically beat up. But it did sort of very much push the anti-colonial struggle and the liberation struggle of India. So I don't think we should, again, confuse symbolic protest necessarily with violence. Symbolic protest, I think, should be, because it's symbolic, should be effective. And I think in this situation, it hasn't been.
All right. Okay, we need to take a short break. Don't go away. When we come back, the results of our online poll on the issue and the final words of our guests. Stay tuned. You're watching Opposing Views. Welcome back. This is Opposing Views. I'm Rod Nepomuceno. Still with us is Professor Danilo Arao and Professor Sylvia Claudio. The question, is the recent confrontation between UP activists and Secretary Butch Abad justified? Now, I was supposed to throw in more questions, but I'd like to read more comments. No? It looks like this is a very heated topic, and we're getting a lot of comments from important people. This one is from the Ako Bicol Party List Representative Rogelio Batucabe, and he said, as an alumnus of the UP School of Economics, I'm ashamed that within the bastion of economic freedom, or academic freedom rather, there is a bigoted, misguided, and intolerant minority that does not know how to respect the views of others. And I'll read another statement, this time from Senator Pia Cayetano. UP's academic freedom gives everyone the right to speak up, to challenge ideas, debate with passion, and fight for one's principles. But this freedom does not include the right to physically assault anyone just because you disagree with his or her own views. I'll let you comment on this, Professor Danny, because obviously this is against your view.
Yeah. Well, it's like this. We do respect the opinion of our legislators here, but we have to remember again, was there really a physical assault in the first place? Because what happened was a throwing of crumpled papers. That's it, according to Stand UP. And even assuming that there were coins that were pelted and placards, and there was, Abad being pulled by the collar or whatever. So the point here is there's no violence involved, whether it's a low degree of violence or a high degree of violence.
Your position is that there was no violence.
There was no violence, really. And we have to look at also the bigger picture, which is the disbursement acceleration program. Again, we go back to the issue of activism in the university. Are we trying to send a message to stand up that they should now sit down, that they should forget about such kinds of creative measures so that we can be civil to the ones who are exploiting us? Definitely not, because we will continue to fight.
Did you want
for the
this
rights.
kind of coverage, though, or reaction from people? Do you think that this is ideal, that people are talking about this, and therefore we're magnifying the real issue?
You know, it's a given, Rod, that any disruptive behavior could be met negatively by the public. And the basic challenge now, not just for Stand UP, but for other activist groups and individuals, would be to what? To ensure that a proper explanation and contextualization is done so that we could achieve what Abad wants, which is sober discourse, right? And this kind of discourse is the thing that we would want to explain to the public.
You don't think that's going to get anywhere if it's a kind of a,
I'm sorry?
You don't think it's going to get anywhere if it was the usual cordial discourse, as you would say?
Yeah, because by the nature of the balitaktakan, there is a limited time to engage Secretary Abad. Perhaps that would partly explain why it's a blessing in disguise that I'm not there, because I would have wanted to engage him personally
a little more.
To debate the points, but there's really no time to do that. So that's why there is a creative measure that was done.
Okay, I'll throw this question to both of you, professors. Do you think there's a need for the students to apologize? You first, Professor Guy.
I would leave that to the students themselves. I hope they are cognizant of the fact that they have been asked to apologize both by the professors and the student council. So even their students are calling. But
either way, you think if they apologize or didn't apologize, you don't have a position in that?
May I say if it were me?
Sure.
Ganun na lang. Kasi I'm very careful, again because of my work in violence against women. I'm very careful about what I would ask someone to do in terms of a wrong that has been done. No? But if it were me, I would apologize.
Okay. Professor Danny, your thoughts? Do you think that they should apologize or?
Yeah. Well, Stand UP has already issued a statement that it will not apologize, and it stands by what happened that fateful night of September 17. And of course, as faculty advisor, they did not get my permission for that kind of a statement, but I generally agree with that kind of a stand in the sense that they did something that was within the bounds of well, whatever you call it, decency or restraint. Because it's not as if there was a physical, it's not as if Abad had cuts and bruises because of a bruised ego maybe, but other than that, there was nothing that was done against him. If at all, it was just simply a symbolic protest. If they were to apologize to me, they would be apologizing on the basis of not throwing and aiming better.
Okay, but let's say if it was an egg, or it was something a little harder than a coin, or a little harder than, or a little bigger than a coin, or a little bigger than a crumpled piece of paper. Do you think then they would have gone overboard?
Well, if it's something that would result in cuts and bruises and something that would seriously injure, then perhaps that's the answer. But remember that Esperon, then the chief of staff way back in 2006, was pelted with eggs before. And it's not as if our colleagues from the Department of Political Science at that time who invited him, and the Third World Studies Center that invited him, asked the students to apologize. There was not much hula-baloo about it. But this time, at the School of Economics, there seems to be a different perception.
There seems to be more emotion behind this,
I think,
this issue. Now,
I would think so.
Now, I'm going to ask this to both of you. You're both activists, right? You were active, you still are. You still are activists, but of a different spectrum, I guess. Do you think there's a middle ground to this, Professor Danny? Do you think there's a middle ground to this? Yeah. Are we just talking about levels here? Just levels? And I mean, for example, well, is it all right to throw invectives and to shout profanity?
Okay, we're talking of strategies and tactics. I thought it's ideological because we have to look at strategies and tactics as being based on ideological persuasion. Because, for example, there are certain ideological persuasions that would allow you to engage the powers that be in the legal front, okay? So in that particular aspect, then you have to abide by certain norms, and that's what Stand Up did. Because, for the record, Stand UP is a legal organization, despite what the police and the military are wont to say, okay? Or the intelligence community is wont to say. Because there is restraint given to Abad as regards what happened. There was no physical injury that was apparent. And as I said a while ago, Stand Up engages in a continuing assessment of what happened. And it even reached out to the School of Economics Student Council to find out really if there were people who were injured so that they can get the entire picture. So so we have to give due credit to that particular student organization
and, what is
and
the
not just
ground?
focus
what is
on
what would have been the acceptable action in that scenario, given all the emotion, all the bottled up emotion, and all the context, you would say? What would have been probably acceptable to everyone?
Given that we now have the benefit of hindsight, I can tell you, Rod, that the more ideal scenario would be for Abad to engage the students, okay?
A little longer, a little longer perhaps.
Yeah, because there had been cases of protest actions where the ones who are the subject of a protest action would get out and then talk to the student leaders. And it's not as if these leaders get vilified or, hurt by engaging. But what Abad did based on the video was to just simply be whisked away to the nearby SUV. That's it.
Professor Guy, do you think there's a middle ground to this whole
We had it before this violent incident. Because in UP, it's always the middle ground, in the sense that, not that we will have any ideological, the beauty of UP is it's a palenque.
Palenque of ideas.
Ideas, yeah. You can have the extreme right, the extreme left, the atheists, the extreme Catholics.
The elite, the masses.
Yes, the middle ground was that we have had a beautiful symphony of discordant, divergent voices. And sometimes they come together once in a while in a good note, and sometimes they separate. But the harmony of just letting, and that's what I keep saying, UP is radical not because we have communists walking our halls. They walk our halls because everyone from the communist to the reactionary capitalist walks our halls in order to give their ideas freely and safely.
And without fear.
And without fear. And that's just my middle ground. Ang hinihingi ko rin lang naman ay respeto para doon sa lahat, sa kaisipan ng bawat isa. Because that's the lifeblood of the university. And so for me, that should be the middle ground. And I don't think an appeal to civility is a bourgeois, silly little appeal about manners. It's a principled appeal as to how we want to run our intellectual and academic lives in a situation of real freedom for each one.
All right. Now, we've unfortunately reached the final portion of our show, so we have just enough time for your final words and I guess final message to our viewers, who may be they're probably struggling also to figure out whether what side to take on. So, Professor Danny, your final words to our televiewers.
Yeah, as faculty advisor of Stand UP, I can tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that what the students did is within the bounds of what, for lack of a better term, decency, in the sense that it's not as if Secretary Abad was physically harmed that fateful night of September 17. Please understand that there is contextual accuracy to what happened, and we have to look at the bigger issue here. Things do not occur in a vacuum. So therefore, we have to look at the evils of the disbursement acceleration program that has been declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, but which the chief architect in the person of Secretary Abad has insisted to implement, and has even up to now continued to do so, even if there are clear indications that it's illegal and it tends to elicit patronage and promote patronage politics in Philippine society. Activism in UP is alive and well thanks to these student organizations, and we seek your understanding and openness so that we can look at the bigger context. Thank you very much. Good evening to all of you.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Danny. Professor Guy, your final words?
My final words would be this. I really think that morally, violence was done to Secretary Abad, perhaps not severe. And I think that if you just look at social media and other forms of media, there are quite a lot of number of people who have agreed with me, even the comments on this show. So I think there are two things that need to be requested here of Stand UP, which is to perhaps listen to some criticisms and reassess what happened, because the bottom line is we all agree that there is a problem with the specific issue of that. Well, I do, and with a greater issue of corruption. And the real question is, did this particular incident help our common cause, or did it give a nalihis, no? We went somewhere else, which isn't good, and perhaps gave not such a good name to activism, no? Because activism is not just about your ideological position. It's about fighting for what you believe. And all of us should fight for what we believe. I would like to believe all of us should be fighting against DAP. But even if you want to fight for DAP, then that is part of what the university should allow you to stand for. And therefore, I really think that this might have given us a black mark in terms of those who would like to be yabang and call ourselves activists.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Guy. Again, thank you very much to our guests, Professor Danny and Professor Guy. Thank you so much for joining us here in Opposing Views. Now let's see the viewers' opinion through our online poll. Is the recent confrontation between UP activists and Secretary Butch Abad justified? Those who said yes, 35% was justified, and those who said no, 65%. And that's our Opposing Views for tonight. Tune in again next week for another bold and engaging discussion on today's most relevant issues. I'm Nepomuceno. Good night, God bless, happy weekend. Pelting of rotten eggs and mud inside UP campus to former Armed Forces Chief of Staff Hermogenes Esperon. The burning of chairs of some PUP protesters against the impending tuition hike. The heckling of activists against President Aquino in several occasions. And recently, the confrontation between Budget Secretary Butch Abad and UP activists about the disbursement acceleration program. These are some of the methods through which activists expressed their dissent to the government. But some believe that these acts have gone overboard and have become a display of hooliganism. Some faculty members of the UP School of Economics in a statement said the act against Butch Abad is a blow to UP's honor. UP President Alfredo Pascual also released a statement saying that they are investigating this disappointing act, echoing the palace's dismay. But the Student Alliance for the Advancement of Democratic Rights in UP, or Stand UP, the organizer of that protest, said they will not apologize and that Secretary Abad deserves it as he represents the ongoing greed and corruption in the government. Welcome to Opposing Views, a hard, straightforward discussion of today's most pressing issues. Tonight, we'll weigh in if the recent run-in of militant students to Secretary Budget Butch Abad is a legitimate act of protest or a display of violence. Our debate question for tonight is the recent conflict...
was there harm done on Butch Abad? Well, his pride may have been hurt, his ego may have been shattered because of what happened, but he did not sustain any serious injuries. And in fact, he was even allowed to get inside his SUV. And one little detail that wasn't mentioned publicly is the fact that the guards of Abad even mentioned to the stand-up students, sagasaan na yan. Okay? So there was actually harassment being done, ironically, on the students who were protesting, when in fact it's supposed to be their campus and they have the right to express dissent. And why should we welcome that kind of a person who, as we mentioned a while ago, is the chief instigator of the presidential pork barrel? So we shouldn't lose sight, and we shouldn't be discussing too much time as to whether or not the acts were violent. We should be focusing on the contextual accuracy of the issue, which is the disbursement acceleration program.
Whether contextually that reaction was merited.
That's
all
correct.
Right. Professor Sylvia, do you think the students went overboard? Again, as mentioned by Professor Danny, there are some conflicting reports whether the students themselves threw points or whether there was collaring or pulling of the sleeves as claimed by Secretary Abad.
Yes.
But do you think, assuming those things happened, do you think that the students may have just gone a little bit overboard in this situation?
Yeah, I base my my judgment on the official statement of the UP School of Economics Student Council, who invited Secretary Abad as one of the groups who sponsored that talk, and they did mention that there was a group of students and non-students. The statement was Anak Bayan rather,
national,
and another group affiliated with Stand UP. So. They sort of thought that this was one group together, that this group of both students and non-students had really barred all exits to make sure that they would catch Secretary Abad. And the UP School of Economics Student Council, in fact, denounced it was their term, the violence. So I think two issues here, and perhaps we should also look at whether, no matter how incensed you are at what a person does, is it really in the university a call for that kind of aggressive and hostile reaction to a person who was also invited? Actually, the UP School of Economics and the UP Student Council and the UP Student Council itself of Diliman had invited
and what do you
Secretary
use aggressive
Abad.
and hostile action? Because obviously, I think here it's sometimes a matter of definition. Some people might not be too insulted with a crumpled piece of paper or perhaps an egg, for example, or a slipper that happened to some U.S. presidents.
Yes.
But in your mind, when do you draw the line? What is aggressive and hostile behavior?
Well, I put myself, I've experienced also some amount of aggression, mostly verbal.
Yes.
From student activists
and is this
who
acceptable?
quite don't agree. Well,
is this acceptable?
Let me give you an example. A friend said that in one of the discussion boards about this issue, where I have taken a stand against it, somebody commented, kalad ka rin na yan si Claudio.
Between UP activists and Butch Abad justified. Good evening, I'm Rod Nepomuceno, and this is Opposing Views. Joining us tonight in our discussion is Professor Danilo Arao, Faculty Advisor of the Student Alliance for the Advancement of Democratic Rights in UP, or STAND UP. Professor Danny, good evening.
Yes, good evening, Rob.
Welcome back to Opposing Views.
Yes, of course. I'm happy to be here.
All right. Can you give us your quick thoughts on this debate question? You think that the actions of the UP students were justified?
It's very much justified if you look at the culture of dissent and the culture of protest at not just the University of the Philippines, but in other places of the country. Please remember that the so-called violent acts only constitute what? The throwing of crumpled papers against a particular government official who is said to be the chief architect of the disbursement acceleration program. It is a symbol of collective dissent as to why this government official and the administration insist on implementing a program that is already declared unconstitutional by no less than the Supreme Court. So it's very much justified for me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Danny. And on the opposing side is Professor Sylvia Claudio of the UP College of Social Work and Community Development. Good evening, Professor Sylvia.
Good evening.
And welcome again.
Yes, thank you. Nice to be here again.
Yeah, your quick thoughts on this debate question. Do you think it was justified, the acts of the UP
well,
students?
no, not really. And I read the report and looked at the incident itself. I thought it was a little bit more than crumpled papers. I heard there were coins tossed, and that they did try to collar him or touch him. And my view is, for this particular incident, wrong place, not in the university should we do that, because he was invited as well. And perhaps wrong timing. And maybe we can discuss that a little bit more.
A little bit more in detail. All right, thank you very much. And again, thank you for joining us this evening. So again, I'd like to discuss again your initial thoughts. No? When this happened, obviously there were a lot of claims. No? There were some claims by Secretary Abad, and when he reported this or made statements to the media, and then obviously there was a statement on the part of the UP students. Professor Danny, your initial thoughts. What went through your mind when you heard about this, and do you think that this is at par with what is expected from UP students?
Well, I wasn't there when the confrontation happened. Actually, I was in Malate, Manila for a family gathering, but I was duty-bound as a faculty advisor of STAND UP to ask what really happened.
Because they were there.
Yeah, because they were there. And from what I gathered, it appears that, yes, the crumpled papers were thrown, but as far as the coin throwing was concerned and the so-called pagcuello, or the collaring of the, if such a word exists, of Butch Abad, wasn't instigated by STAND UP. Assuming that it happened,
it wasn't there. You think
it
outsiders were involved?
Probably, because if you look at the press release of Anakbayan National, which is a different organization, there was mention about coins. As regards placards and the collars, the data would be quite insufficient to judge. But nevertheless, assuming for the sake of argument that such things really happened,
coins.
Would it really constitute violence